A very good afternoon to all of you joining us today, and welcome to the Office of Research Regulatory Affairs November Research Matters. I am Scott Myers, the Clinical Research Educator for UT Southwestern's Office of Research Regulatory Affairs, and I will be one of the moderators for today's session. A few things you should know before we get started. If you have any questions for our presenters during today's session, please type them in the Q&A chat box, and one of the moderators will respond to you during the session, or we will address it at the end of the presentations. This session is being recorded, and you can watch it again right after it's finished by clicking on the Microsoft Teams live link in the email invitation. You can find the links to future meetings and past recordings on the Human Research Protection Program Office's Research Matters website under the Training and Resources page. We do provide a certificate of attendance for those who have logged in using a valid email address. If you do not receive one via email, but should have, please send an email to hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu to request a certificate. Lastly, we want to hear from you. We use the information you provide to plan for future topics for these sessions. It's also an opportunity for you to let us know how our speakers did and how our department is doing. So please take a few minutes to complete the survey to provide your feedback. You may access the survey using your phone via the QR code here on the screen or your computer by selecting the link. And we will also drop the link to the survey in the Q&A chat box momentarily. Okay. All right, so here is the agenda for today. First, Mayad Bird, our IRB director, will provide updates from the Human Research Protection Program Office. Next, Neela Dinesh and Jonathan Hunter from our Conflicts of Interest Office will present From Transparency to Trust, Navigating Conflicts of Interest. Their presentation will provide an overview of conflicts of interest and the COI office process for identifying, reviewing, and managing conflicts of interest. Then, Noah Hendricks from our IRB office will present IRB Policy 101, the Policy Process Perspective. This will be a presentation about how research oversight policy is made from the federal government down to UT Southwestern, and an explanation of some challenges that make policy change difficult and why such changes matter to the research community. Noah recently presented a poster on this topic at the recent Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research Annual Conference, and we thought you would enjoy hearing about it here today also. And finally, if time permits, we will conclude with an open Q&A session. Okay, without further ado, Mayad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to try to make sure I get my slides shared and that I'm shared. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I have a few updates for the research community. One of the first updates that I want to talk about, hang on, this is my first view in this new atmosphere, and I'm having a hard time navigating my screen. Okay, I'm just going to transfer slides on this side. Okay, so the first slide is one with regard to good clinical practice training. So last month we talked about the updates to the good GCP training and the R3 modules, those becoming available on cityprogram.org. They were available as of late October. I think that some of you all might have been experiencing some concerns or some problems with accessing the updated training. So we shared recently with some of the research community members that you've got some options with regard to GCP training. As I mentioned before, some noted that they were not able to access the training modules. So here are just a couple of tips that you can use to help with updating your R3 required GCP training. So the first one would be just to wait until you're within that 90-day window. And so you'll have the opportunity to complete the GCP refresher course, obviously within that 90-day window. If you absolutely need it to complete the training to meet any type of sponsor requirement, you may have to go in and actually do a whole new basic program as a workaround. And then finally, you can just document the optional module completion instead of completing the whole GCP R3 requirement. So again, these are just some additional options that we're offering or that we've discovered may be beneficial to the research community. As we noted last month, the R3 requirements, we are not adopting that the fact that you have to change those right away, only whenever your GCP training is expired, that you need to update your R3 requirements. The next change, some of you all have received information from Sponsored Program Administration. There's been a change to the vendor that issues our ClinCard, the Greenfire ClinCard. They are now going by the name of Suvoda Greenfire Patient Payments. So there've been a lot of questions related to us updating our informed consent document to remove some of that templated language. We went a little further with our template language. We updated our informed consent document to now indicate if any type of payment is going to be paid, that you provide that information in the informed consent document. And we kind of, again, changed the information about being specific to use of the term ClinCard. One of the things I wanted to mention is we are waiting to confirm compliance with regard to whether if you have the old Greenfire ClinCard statement in your IRB approved consent form. We're trying to make sure that there are not going to be any compliance concerns if that language were to stay the same. And what this would do is help you not have to submit a modification to your informed consent document or make plans to reconsent individuals, again, based on that new vendor information. We are planning to get these informed consent templates updated on our website, but as you all know, there's a big push for accessibility changes with regard to what we post. So we're working against those, or I shouldn't say against, we're working with those requirements in mind as we plan to make changes to our website. The next thing I wanted to talk about is this is kind of fresh off the press, funded exempt study migration. It's finally here. So today, or I should say actually yesterday evening, we worked to migrate exempt studies that were at EIRB to Ethos. So it was approximately 200 studies. And again, this is after we went through a really long activity of narrowing down all of the studies that are exempt, that are funded, and then confirming that those funded exempt studies were actually open and active. The reason we decided to migrate those exempt funded studies is because we needed to keep the Velos ID intact. There was actually not a way to assign a previous Velo ID to a new Ethos record. So if you have an exempt study that was in EIRB and it's been now migrated, so you should see the status of migration. If you had any modifications or reportable events open, we're going to kind of close those out. And then once we actually stand your study up and when it's fully migrated, we're going to initiate that modification or the reportable event in Ethos. Once your study is fully migrated to Ethos, you'll be able to manage your study there, submit modifications, reportable events, anything else. I do also want to note that the EIRB system obviously is going to remain intact as there for historical information to meet any type of record retention policies that we have in place. Okay, that's it on that. What I also want to note is that during this exempt migration funding activity, we may come across some exempt funded studies where maybe the grant information we have in EIRB may not be adequate, it may be outdated, or we may not just be able to find the funding information. As we migrate the study to Ethos, there's going to be an activity that we can use to reach out to the research community to ask you to verify and complete that information so that we have most up-to-date current funding on the protocol. And one other thing I wanted to note with this migration, we saw this morning with a sample migration, was that there are some personnel listed in EIRB And when we went to go to try to upload those individuals in Ethos, it turns out that their HSP training was outdated, so it didn't allow us to add those individuals. So as a note, those individuals will be removed. So it'll be really, really important for you to look at individuals on the study that may have been removed during this transition and re-add those individuals back to your Ethos application. Just a quick reminder on exempt studies that are not funded. They're going to stay in EIRB. If you have any type of modification that needs to occur to that particular study, we're going to ask that you stand the study up in Ethos and then modify your study. Any modifications that we have that are active in EIRB at this point in time, we're going to withdraw those. Again, it's because the IRB staff can't maintain submissions in both systems. So as I mentioned below is some steps on what you would need to do to submit a modification or reportable event to an existing exempt study. Again, you have to create the study in Ethos. You'll want to make sure that you include the legacy IRB protocol number for the converted study in that section 2, item number 3 of the Ethos application. The study will undergo a review process, quickly get approved. And then again, if you have any modifications or any other business that you need to submit, you can do so again after the study is approved. And then once it's been approved, we'll inactivate the study over in EIRB. Just another thing I wanted to clarify is with regard to clinicaltrials.gov registration and study activation. Previously, we held all submissions regardless of whether the sponsor was the responsible party or the PI was the responsible party, and registering clinicaltrials.gov or their study onto clinicaltrials.gov. Just a quick clarification on this now. When the sponsor is the responsible party, we will not hold activation. We'll allow it to go through the green light process. Just kind of a reminder, making sure that you're working with your sponsor and that they know that they have the responsibility of registering their clinical trial in accordance with those requirements. And then if we have a PI and our PI is the responsible party, we are going to hold green light. We won't allow the study to be activated. Again, it's because we want to make sure as an institution we're meeting those clinicaltrial.gov requirements. And then I think this is the last topic that I have. You probably all have received some emails back from the IRB analyst. So in the actual modification form, you have a space or a question asks you to provide a brief summary of changes. The reason we ask for those changes is because we want to know at a quick glance, what is happening? Why are you changing the study? What's going to be impacted by the study, the changes? This matters because it helps set the tone for us being able to review the remainder of the modification. It helps us reduce kind of the back and forth between the IRB staff and then going back to the research coordinator to ask for clarifications on an appropriate summary. Obviously, this helps support regulatory documentation. I think what we've been seeing is kind of a list of documents being changed in the summary of modification. We've seen not enough information being included maybe in the rationale. For example, we've seen things like, okay, I've got an update from a sponsor, but that's really not telling the IRB why there are changes occurring to this particular protocol. I have some examples I wanted to kind of share with you all. So here is a poor example. So the poor example is, okay, we've got an updated informed consent document. We've revised the protocol. The rationale is that the sponsor updated the documents. In this situation, it's vague. It really doesn't help describe what the changes that are being made to the protocol and why those changes are being made. Again, as an IRB, one of the responsibilities that we have is to ensure that we look out and protect research participants. So if we don't have enough information and we have to dig for that information, it may take us longer, number one. And number two, it may not help us come to the right conclusion with regard to the protection of human subjects. Here is a good example of, or we should say an effective example. So in this situation, there's a summary that we've updated the informed consent document where we've changed from version 5 of the protocol to version 6. We've included newly identified risk of nausea, revised the protocol to change the visit window for plus or minus 3 days to plus or minus 5 days. And then the rationale to support this change is, okay, we've got some updated risk language based on safety monitoring. The visit window was updated to reduce the missed visits while maintaining data integrity, because we know all of those protocol deviations that occur, it's because that plus or minus window is a little too narrow. So this effective example gives us really clear-cut information. It's specific, it describes what's changing and why it's changing, and it helps the IRB to really focus on safety and feasibility. So again, if you could just spend a little bit more time extrapolating a summary, a high-level summary of changes in those many documents that are provided by the sponsor, it's going to really help us hone in, efficiently review your modification and move it forward, and not get any questions from our IRB members. That is all that I have to share. Oh, sorry, one more update. Parkland. So last month we talked about Parkland, and we talked about their data sharing requirements, and we were still trying to identify a place to put Parkland's exhibit. And just to kind of share with you all, this is what the thought process is. We do need to make sure that we have the appropriate ancillary review committee, so to speak, in place in RAS. But ultimately, you're going to submit your study to the IRB. We're going to do a pre-review. We're going to identify whether Parkland is involved, and that whether data is going to be shared from Parkland to UT Southwestern. If that is the case, we're going to trigger this new internal practice and ancillary review that's called Parkland Data Sharing. And this is going to allow for Parkland to upload that signed exhibit, or make an evaluation and upload the signed exhibit. And then we're going to continue with our review. I want to note that we're not going to stop or hold up your submissions if we don't have that exhibit in place. But I want to make sure you also know that if in the future you go to modify your study and any of those components are changing, for example, you're adding more elements to collect from Parkland that are going from Parkland or will be stored here at UT Southwestern, or you have a new collaborator, or you're sharing more information with the collaborator, the IRB is going to look for that the approved exhibit to make sure that those data sharing requirements are met, and that we don't need to seek out a new exhibit to be signed by Parkland. And if a new one's needs to be signed, we'll follow this same process of triggering an ancillary review, again, allowing Parkland to do their review and execute that exhibit. So this is now actually my final slide. Thank you, and I will turn things over to you, Neela and Jonathan.
Okay, everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining the call today. So I'm Jonathan Hunter. I am the Director of Conflict of Interest and Export Control here at UT Southwestern. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Neela, who's going to introduce herself and do the majority of the presentation. Before I do that, I just wanted to make one quick announcement. We have a new assistant director here in the office. Her name is Laura Snowden. She's in the background on this call in case she can answer any questions, but just an FYI for all of you, in case you have questions, Laura will be available on this call, but then also regular office hours as well. So Neela, go for it. I'm going to be in the background.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. I'm Neela Dinesh. I'm a regulatory monitoring analyst here at UT Southwestern. So today's presentation will cover the conflict of interest and the COI office process for reviewing and managing conflict of interest. Just bear with me. Okay. So here's a quick overview of the presentation today. We will begin by understanding conflict of interest, and then look at the COI office workflow as well as the COI committee review process. Then we will also look at a few examples of COI management strategies and understand how these are applied to manage the COI with the help of a few case studies. Then I will also point to the relevant policies and regulations for conflict of interest, and then pass it to Jonathan, who will share some important upcoming information, as well as the COI Policy Commission. So conflict of interest can be broadly defined as the tendency for secondary interests to be prioritized over the primary interests. The COI office at UT Southwestern is tasked with ensuring that the outside relationships do not bias the design, conduct, or reporting of research, doesn't detract from teaching, research, clinical, or administrative responsibilities, and doesn't influence the research training of students or trainees. Now, also to ensure that this doesn't result in improper transfer of state resources. Previous presentations in this forum by my colleagues at the COI office have addressed how to submit a statement of financial interest and what to disclose in these statements. Once the statement of financial interest is submitted to the COI office, we review the statements and understand the activities and interests disclosed, ensure that the activities disclosed are permissible as per UT Southwestern policy. Certain activities such as promotional speaking is not permissible at UT Southwestern. Then we will also coordinate the supervisor review and approval of the outside activities. So the supervisor approval is the first step in the assessment of the submitted statements. Once the activity is approved by the supervisor, then the statement moves to the next phase, which is the COI assessment phase. In this phase, we evaluate the disclosed interests and activities to see if there is any relatedness to the individual's UT Southwestern responsibilities. This could be research responsibilities, teaching, clinical, or any other administrative responsibilities. And if we find there is absolutely no relation to the disclosed outside interest and the UT Southwestern responsibilities, then it is determined that there is no COI. However, if we find some overlaps with the disclosed outside interest, then we take a closer look, reach out for additional information, and evaluate to see how the outside activity or interest relates to UT Southwestern research or other responsibilities. If a COI is identified, then this is presented to the COI committee for further review. The COI committee comprises of UT Southwestern faculty appointed by the president of UT Southwestern. The committee reviews the identified COI and determines if the conflict of interest can be managed or if it is not possible to manage the COI. If the determination is that the COI is unmanageable, then COI is eliminated by either non-participation in the UT Southwestern activity or divesting the personal financial interest. However, the majority of the identified COIs are definitely manageable. So in such situation, the committee, upon detailed discussion and considering all the relevant situations, approves an appropriate management plan, which outlines various strategies that must be followed at all times. There is a 5-day review period before the management plan is signed. So the recipient does get an opportunity to look at all the requirements on the management plan, reach out to the COI office for further clarification or ask any questions. There's also an opportunity to challenge or appeal any of the requirements listed on the management plan. This would be a written appeal where you discuss why a particular requirement is not acceptable, or if or request any changes to that particular requirement. Usually the COI committee accepts all or part of the appeal. But if the COI committee decides not to accept the appeal, the next appeal goes to Dr. Lee. The goal of the management plan is to ensure that research or institutional responsibilities can be carried out to the extent possible without bias. Here are a few common COI management strategies that are routinely used. I just want to add that this is definitely not a complete list of available strategies. There's a wide variety of management strategies that are possible, and those are all determined on a case-by-case basis, looking at the specific situation and discussion by the COI committee. So I just picked a few handful of the most common approaches, just to give you a flavor of what to expect on a management plan. Appropriate disclosures is definitely a very popular management strategy that is widely used across institutions to help bring transparency to the situation. So this would require disclosures in publications, relevant informed consents, disclosures to trainees and staff and collaborators, etc. So I would like to point out that the expectation is that if there's a study or an award that is directly related to the financial interest, in such a situation, the expectation is that there would be disclosures in all of the publications and the informed consents that is relevant to the COI. So the study or the award that is directly related to the COI are the ones where the disclosures are required. Changing the reporting structure is another strategy that is usually applied when the supervisor and the staff have financial interests in the same entity. We often see COIs where the PI and the postdocs have co-developed an technology and have started a new company, and they're all co-founders on the same company. In such a situation, the reporting structure is usually of the staff is usually changed to the next level supervisor to manage the COI. I just want to point out that this does not affect the day-to-day relationship, the day-to-day work equations or the scientific relationships. The change in reporting structure is strictly from the HR point of view for the purposes of annual evaluations and approving outside activity and such. Restricted data sharing is another strategy that is usually used in situations where we find that the outside entity has research overlaps with UT Southwestern research interests. Appropriate recusals are required when there are overlaps with UT Southwestern job responsibilities. For example, if an individual in his role at UT Southwestern has to interact with this outside entity where he also has a financial interest, in such situations, the expectation is to recuse himself from such an interaction, such an activity. Eliminating bias in human research is a very important management strategy. This can be achieved by reducing opportunities for bias, by restricting the role played by the individual in research, data analysis, patient recruitment, etc., and also by increasing transparency, maybe by requiring specific language for the informed consent disclosure, requiring a DSMB, etc. Reducing or eliminating a financial interest is another effective strategy. Usually this is used as a last resort, but can also be an effective strategy to manage a conflict of interest. So once again, I would just like to point out that this is definitely not a complete list of all the available strategies. And the appropriate strategy to manage a particular situation is determined by the COI committee based on the specific situation. I would say that no two COIs are identical, so each one has a slightly different situation, and so it's a very deliberate process where all of the interactions are considered before deciding the appropriate management strategies for a given conflict of interest. So let's look at how these strategies are applied with a few examples. Here's a case study of a manageable COI. This is very common, simple and straightforward COI, where there is a consulting activity and a related UT Southwestern research. So you can see here that Dr. Consult serves as an advisor to Biopharma Therapeutics, where he's helping them develop a cancer drug called Destroyum. He also serves as a PI on a UT Southwestern IRB study sponsored by the same company to evaluate another drug by this company. So here you can see that there is no direct, it's not tightly related situation. There's no direct relationship between the work he's doing as his personal financial interest versus the work he's doing here at UT Southwestern. There is a loose relationship because he's interacting with the same entity, both as a UT Southwestern employee as well as because of his consulting activity. So this is a COI that would need to be managed. However, this is what we call a very simple COI. And typically the management plan would look like, requiring them to disclose in relevant publications, relevant informed consents, etc. And also restricted data sharing. There is a sponsored study here, so it's obvious that some amount of data needs to be shared back with the company, but the requirement would look something like do not disclose scientific results that's outside appropriate UT Southwestern agreements. So here's a second example, which is a little bit more complicated, just to kind of let you see how the COIs can really vary in their complexity. And this is, again, another example that we commonly see at UT Southwestern. We have several startup companies that are based on UT Southwestern license. This is an example where Dr. John Doe is a co-founder of a startup company called Invista Technologies. He has invented an IP, which has been, this IP has been licensed for use by this company from UT Southwestern. So he's an inventor on the license, and he also provides uncompensated consulting for Invista Technology. He's also the PI on an NIH award that resulted in the IP that is now being licensed by the company. He's also a PI on an ongoing animal study, and he's still trying to develop more information, generate more data that is related to this particular technology. He also has a postdoc, Dr. Partner, who is also a co-founder of the same company and is also an inventor on the IP and is also part of the animal study. Both the PI and the postdoc are uniquely qualified to conduct the study. There is no one else at UT Southwestern or no one in the research field that has the expertise needed to conduct this study. So as you can see, there's so many moving wheels to this COI. He is a co-founder, inventor. He does consulting as his personal financial interest. He's also on a PI and an award, and a federal award, and there's an animal study, and also has a postdoc who has interest in the same entity. So as you can clearly see, this is a COI for the postdoc as well. So we would definitely issue a management plan for the postdoc in addition to the PI. And the management plan would look something like this. It would like disclose your interests appropriately in relevant publications, etc. Informed consent is not included here because there is no IRB study. This is only an animal study, so we didn't include that. But we would say disclose in publications, presentations, collaborators, staffs, etc. And then a restricted data sharing. So here you can see there is no sponsored research, there is no sub-award from NIH, and there is definitely a lot of overlap in the research interests between the company and UT Southwestern. So we would say, because there's all this research overlap, do not disclose scientific results unless there is an agreement with UT Southwestern. Changing the reporting structure would be needed because the postdoc has financial interest in the same entity. So then the reporting structure would be changed to the next level supervisor. And recusing from negotiations with UT Southwestern. This is an important one because he's an inventor. He's a UT Southwestern employee, and he also has financial interest in a startup company. So he cannot negotiate with UT Southwestern on behalf of the company. Dr. Doe would have to hire somebody else and appoint them as a CEO of the company so they can participate in negotiations with UT Southwestern. Here's a third example, and this one is what we call unmanageable COI. So here's a case study where Dr. Brown is a faculty member at a big medical school, and he discovers a drug for diabetes. This drug is licensed by Drug Startup Inc., and they want to conduct a clinical trial at the big state medical school and want to use their patient population. In addition, they have proposed to use have Dr. Brown serve as the principal investigator on the study. Now, this is typically what we would call an unmanageable COI for Dr. Brown because he has a potential for bias. He's an inventor and he cannot also be the PI for a clinical study because he would have an opportunity to influence the clinical trial in his role as a PI. I also want to point out that there are aspects of institutional COI in this particular situation, but I'm not going to discuss the institutional COI for the purpose of today's talk. That's a topic for another complete presentation. So I'm just addressing the individual COI part of the situation. So I also want to point out that, yeah, it looks unmanageable for Dr. Brown, but there is always, if you change one or two factors here and there, then maybe the goal is always try to see what is the best way we can still achieve the goal without having a COI in the mix, right? By ensuring that there is no bias. So in this situation, an acceptable option would be that, of course, it's unmanageable, but if a non-conflicted individual could serve as a PI, then that might work. Again, I'm only referring to the individual financial conflict of interest perspective. The institutional COI is a completely different topic that I haven't addressed. Here are some regulations and policies that are relevant to conflict of interest. Code of Federal Regulations 42 CFR 50 subpart F, promoting objectivity in research. This is relevant and it is applicable to all institutions that receive PHS funding. This requires that investigators disclose personal financial interests annually and also requires that the institutions manage the financial COI. We also have several UT Southwestern policies that are relevant for conflict of interest. ETH 104 is the conflict of interest policy. This discusses COI training and annual disclosure requirements. EMP 158 is a conflict of commitment policy. This addresses permissible outside activities as well as the supervisor approval process. INP 101 is the tech dev and the IP management policy. This restricts the role a UT Southwestern employee may play in a startup company in which UT Southwestern has a financial interest. RES 401 is specific to research COI, and this discusses the identification and management of research COIs, functions of COI committee, non-compliance process, etc. So I will now pass this to Jonathan, who will share some additional information on upcoming changes.
Thank you, Neela. Nice job. So just want to let everybody know, and we may have announced this a little bit before, but diving into this, we have some of the things here that Neela mentioned that are working pretty well and some areas where we have a lot of opportunities for improvement. And as we've been talking with Dr. Podolsky about those opportunities for improvement, he really cares about COI, which is great. I've never been at an institution with a president who cares so much about COI. So that's wonderful. And what we talked about and what he ultimately decided was, in order to address those opportunities for improvement, he wanted to establish the COI Policy Commission. So that has been convened. We had meeting number 1 in October. We're currently planning the rest of the schedule. And the purpose really, as it says here, is to conduct a comprehensive review of all COI-related policies. And this is the whole program. We're looking at everything from what needs to be disclosed to how we review those interests that are disclosed, for the appropriate ways to manage those interests, as Neela mentioned below or above. And ultimately, again, every aspect of the program. So this is really exciting. It's a pretty big deal. And the commission includes multiple leaders from across the institution representing basic clinical, patient care, institutional considerations, legal considerations, all of the various angles at which we approach conflicts of interest. We're also taking a really good look at other institutions' policies. Those are institutions within the UT system, but also institutions from across the country. And that includes comprehensive institutions that include humanities, for example, and also medical specific institutions or biomedical specific institutions. It includes private institutions and public institutions. We're really taking a broad approach to this comparison just to see where we have some opportunities to align with what some of our peers are doing. That includes also looking more closely at those regulations that Neela mentioned above, just to make sure that in anything that we do, we are, of course, aligned with those regulatory requirements that exist. And the discussion then, not only is it that review of the peer institution's policies, but also deep analysis, conceptual analysis of a variety of issues. Like, what is a significant financial interest? We currently define that differently than the regulations do. And so is this an opportunity to align with the regulations, or do we feel like we need to have some additional considerations? Concepts like motivation and reciprocity, and again, diving into those management strategies. So this is very exciting work. We anticipate that the commission will be convened for approximately 6 months or so. Coming out of the commission, there's going to be a number of recommended changes, and then we'll work within Aura, and then obviously in conjunction with Dr. Podolsky's team and the legal team to make some of those or all of those recommended changes into policy changes. And then flowing from that will, of course, be some procedural changes, some changes to the InfoEd COI portal for what gets disclosed. So this is a really big deal, and we're very excited to be doing it. So just to let you know, again, these aren't happening all tomorrow, but coming down the pipeline, what you see now may end up changing quite a bit. And so we just wanted to set the stage for that. And of course, we will keep you updated as the commission progresses. So once again, thank you, everybody. And I will turn it over to Noah now.
Okay, I think everything is now good to go. Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for being here. Yeah, so my name is Noah Hendricks. I'm a pre-reviewer for the IRB and the Office of Research Regulatory Affairs. And my goal today is just to share a little bit of background about the policies that are relevant for IRB review, and also some of the policy process and how policies change over time, and to help make that relevant for the research community. So I appreciate Scott and the Research Matters team for inviting me to present. As he mentioned, I had a poster at IRB conference last week, and so I just wanted to take a little bit of that, the parts that are relevant, and share them with the research community at UT Southwestern. And so I really wanted to start with a basic overview of where our rules in the IRB come from. And I kind of have it split into two camps here. And the first is federal regulations, and the second is local context. So there are three really main governing bodies that come into review, or that come into play for most of our reviews. The first being the Department of Health and Human Services, the second being the Food and Drug Administration, and the third being the Office of Civil Rights. So the first, HHS, they set the general guidelines for human subjects research. So that will include behavioral, social research, in addition to things like clinical research. And also they have special rules for projects with federal funding. Then the FDA sets regulations for drug and device trials. So any kind of study that is evaluating the safety or efficacy of a drug or device. And they also harmonize with ICH GCP. So Mayad was talking about the GCP trainings earlier, and some of the complications that we've had around that, because ICH updated the rules for good clinical practice, but the FDA hasn't yet harmonized with a new version. So it's kind of left us in the middle ground, which is why we aren't requiring it as an institution, but we're now offering it because many sponsors that conduct international trials have to be compliant with the new version. And then the Office of Civil Rights, for some might be surprising, but they're the ones that manage
Hey,
HIPAA.
Noah?
Yes.
No, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but you
Sure.
are not sharing your slides. Can you actually share the screen with your slides? It looks like you have PowerPoint open. Sorry about that.
Yeah, is that better? You can see the
There you
slide
go,
now.
Noah.
Yes.
It's,
Yeah,
it's
okay.
all,
Thank
all
you.
set.
Sorry. Sorry. I hit start presentation, but I guess it didn't carry over. Okay. Yeah, so OCR manages HIPAA, and I think that everybody that works in the hospital system will be familiar with HIPAA, but there are also special rules around the research use of HIPAA protected PHI that we have to consider during our reviews. And then that second bucket is local context. So I have that kind of split with the state of Texas and local institutions. The state of Texas, the main way it comes into play is with children's research. So they set the age majority at 18, which means that anything involving people under the age of 18, including 16, 17-year-olds or 17-year-olds, is still considered children. And then local institutions, since we are the IRB of record for Parkland, THR, Skylight, and Children's, we have to work with all of our local partners as well as other departments, like COI, for example. So we have to take all those into account as well. So as an IRB, whenever we make our policies and our procedures, we must stay within all those rules set by higher level authority, namely the federal regulations, and then also work with all those different local context entities. So I included just a screenshot of what the regulations actually look like. These flow down to the study teams, but I don't expect most study teams to be spending a lot of times pulling up Title 45, Part 46, number 116B. That's really our job, but I wanted to share these just as an idea of what that really looks like. And I'll later in the presentation, I'll contrast that to a little bit more of a friendly presentation of these regulations in some of the city trainings. And so the challenge of policy change is really that in order for a policy to change, it requires attention and it requires a certain amount of will to actually create the change. So the framework that I use for the poster, and that is kind of my background in studying policy, is it's called punctuated equilibrium theory, and it is basically an explanation for why policy is mostly stagnant with occasional periods of big changes. So if you look in this chart from the left to the right, that kind of shows how policy changes over time. It's going to mostly be very small change or stagnant with no changes, and then occasional periods, punctuations where there are larger changes. So like I said, in order for a change to actually happen, there has to be attention towards the change with the appropriate decision makers. And so people can only focus on one thing at a time for the most part, but we form organizations so that we can tackle multiple challenges. But even if that's the case, an organization can only attend to a few, and so there's competition for resources and attention whenever it comes to the policy space. And then any change, this must then overcome friction. So the FDA, for example, as I mentioned earlier, hasn't yet harmonized with the good clinical practice changes, likely because they have a long process to review the new rules that they have to undertake before they can actually adopt them. If the FDA wants to change the regulations, they usually first have to open up for a period of public comment, which they did recently in regards to AI regulation. I think that was open for somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And then the next step, once they review all the comments, is if they actually want to update the regulations, they have to put out it's called a notice to proposed rulemaking. So they have to say, hey, here's the changes we plan. Do you want to comment on those again? And so it takes a very long time to actually get to the point of making changes. And that's kind of why there's this conclusion of change generally being either small or big, with medium-sized changes being pretty rare. So what this means for you, for the research community, I think that the part that's most relevant is just the importance of communication. And I think that forums like this, Research Matters, are great. But this is the most important part for a practitioner, whether it's a coordinator or a regulatory associate, to stay on top of changes as they come, whether it's a small change or a large change. So Research Matters is great. The HRPP News listserv is also great. From the IRB side, I think that's where we push out most of our policy and practice changes. And then also, I always encourage people just to communicate with reviewers. We oftentimes end up playing tag on Ethos, sending a study back and forth. But if there are questions about why a change needs to be made, typically there's a regulatory requirement that hasn't been met. And so if you ask that question why, then we'll usually be able to point you towards like, hey, this is the rule that we need to follow. And so that's why the change needs to be made. Resources I want to point out, city trainings are not just things that you hop on every 3 years whenever they expire to scroll through. They do provide good resources. So I went through the HSP course and looked at the informed consent module and took a screenshot that's pictured here on the right side that matches those regulations I had opened earlier, and just a more user-friendly part that will be a little bit more applicable to your work. So if you were to be working on a consent form and once a month, once every couple months, pull up the consent form on one side, the city training on the other, and work through it that way, I think that's a really good exercise to practice making sure that all those things are included at the time of initial submission. And then we also have all of our UT Southwestern policies that are currently still written for EIRB. I know that we're in the process of updating those things, but all the different regulatory requirements are up to date because those haven't changed in the last year. Okay, so that concludes my portion. I think now it's just going to be a general Q&A session. And so I'll turn this back over to Scott.
Excuse me, did not have my microphone on. So, okay, everyone, we have now concluded the presentations, and now we are going to move into our Q&A session. So I invite you to submit any questions or comments that you have at this time. I'm going to pause for a few seconds to allow you time to type up any questions. And by the way, I do want you all to be aware in this town hall format that we're using for these presentations, you as attendees are receiving all the information with a 30-second delay from when we actually speak. You will hear it 30 seconds later. So don't mind if there's any long pauses. We just want to make sure that we're accounting for that so that we're able to answer your questions. And also, unfortunately, I think it's happened in the last couple sessions that we didn't think there were any more questions coming. So we ended the meeting and then they all kind of trickled in afterwards. We'll still try to get those answered for you, but I just want to let you all know what's going on there. Also, while we wait for questions, just to remind you of the survey, if you wouldn't mind spending a few minutes to complete the questions, we will use the information to improve these sessions. And we'd also like to hear from you about how we're doing and what areas could be improved or other types of presentations you'd like to hear about in the future. So please, if you have a moment, you could go to that survey. Okay, here's a question that we have just received. Could you clarify a bit about reporting when the spouse who is not a UT Southwestern employee is the one who does business, like consultation, with pharmaceutical companies, and the UT Southwestern employee does not do any direct business with such companies? This person says she has read the policies, but it's still not very clear. Neil or Jonathan, would you be able to answer that?
Yes, I can answer that. Thank you, Scott. So could you clarify a bit about reporting when the spouse who is not a UT Southwestern employee is the one who does business with pharmaceutical companies and the UT Southwestern employee does not do any direct business with such companies? I've read the policies, but to me it is still not clear. Okay, thank you. I needed to read that again. So in terms of the disclosure requirements, you need to think of yourself and your spouse as a unit, right? A disclosing unit. So you can sort of think about that like in the state of Texas. You bought the house, but you get married. So now that house belongs to you and your spouse. So in terms of disclosures, you need to think about it that way. Let me turn my camera on. I apologize. So that is the disclosure requirement. Think of the spouse, you and your spouse, as a unit. In terms of whether or not we would consider that disclosure to represent a conflict of interest, that is a separate question and a really interesting discussion that we have in the COI committee. And again, part of that depends on how that interest that the spouse has would overlap with the UT Southwestern employees' institutional responsibility. So all kinds of considerations and details on that side. But in terms of disclosure, you need to think of yourself and a spouse as a unit.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We'll publish that question too for others to see. Just another moment here. If anybody has a question, go ahead and type that up now. Okay, we don't have anything coming in. I apologize if we're missing something due to the delay. We'll still try to answer you, but for right now, I don't see anything coming in. So I think we can go ahead and conclude. I want to thank all of our presenters and thank all of you for attending today's session. Our next Research Matters is scheduled for December the 16th. So we hope to see you then. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week. Thank you all.